About 5 or 6 years ago, I went over to my friend's house down the street to ask him if he wanted to come play outside. Since neither of us had a phone, we usually just went over to each other's houses whenever we felt like playing, hoping the other person was home. This time was no exception. I rang the doorbell and waited, but nobody came. However, since it was a warm summer day, I thought that maybe my friend and his family were just sitting in their backyard and couldn't hear the bell. Right next to the front door of my friend's house is a window that allows you to see all the way through to the other side of the house, including a backyard window. So I peeked through it to see if they were actually in the backyard. There was no one in the backyard. However, I did see my friend's older sister sitting at the kitchen table behind her laptop. Her back was turned towards me. Excited, I rang the doorbell again, yet still no one responded. Confused as to why no one came, I stared through the window again to see my friend's older sister still sitting behind her laptop. I tried to draw her attention towards me by calling out and knocking on the window. To no avail. The longer I kept looking at her, the more I started to notice something was off. Not only did she not respond to anything I did, she seemed not to move at all. As in, not a single muscle. In fact, the longer I looked, the more certain I became that she wasn't even breathing. Although that would have been hard to see from that distance. She was also holding her right arm in a weird position, as if she was in the middle of moving her cursor. From what I could see, nothing on the screen of her laptop was changing. The longer I kept looking, the more uncomfortable I became. It all just felt so unnatural. At some point I went to the door, opened the letterbox, and yelled her name through it. I repeated this process a few times while staring through the window in between, when all of a sudden a loud crashing noise came from inside. I immediately moved back to the window again to see what was going on, when I saw that my friend's older sister had now stood up, her back still towards me, the laptop seemingly having disappeared. Needless to say, at this point I'm starting to get creeped out. Yet I decided to knock on the window and call out her name again. For a very short moment, nothing happened. Then all of a sudden she turned towards me. Her face was not that of my friend's older sister. It was a face I'd not come across and have not since. But it looked furious. Before I could do anything else, she suddenly started running to what appeared to be the front door. I started walking backwards when I heard a loud bang against the other side of the front door, at which I just turned and ran. At first I believed it was just some dumb prank my friend and his family had played on me, but when I asked him about it the next day at school, he looked at me in confusion. He told me with a serious look in his eyes that he and his family, including his sister, hadn't been home for almost the entire afternoon that day, but that when they came home they did find his older sister's laptop on the floor, and they just assumed that it had been too close to the edge and had eventually fallen off. When I told him what I had seen, he didn't believe me, quite logically so. I wouldn't have believed something like that either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Even after all these years, no one who I've told my story believes me, but I'm certain that what I witnessed that day has happened, and I often spend quite some time wondering just what happened. It still scares me to this day, and I can't find anyone who is willing to talk about it seriously. When I was 20, I moved to a small apartment in Oshawa, Ontario. After being there about a month or so, I knew my way around pretty well, and I started frequenting the local pub for about an hour or two before heading home each night. And I'm not the most sociable person, but one night I decided to stay longer than usual. After a while, the beers caught up to my bladder, and I had to go downstairs to do my business. On my way back up, I bumped into a red-haired woman, and accidentally knocked her over. I apologized as I scrambled to help her back up, and as she was getting back up, she started saying something unintelligible. There was a long moment of silence as we stood there looking at each other. She broke the silence, saying, "I'll see you upstairs." Fast forward about 20 minutes and I'm back upstairs, thinking about what had happened. Another 10 to 15 minutes go by, and the woman hasn't walked back up. I'm a little worried at this point, so I asked the female bartender if she could go down and check on her. Upon returning, she told me that both of the bathrooms were completely empty. This puzzled both of us because she had seen her walk down, but neither of us saw her come back out. So this story takes place around the time of the housing crisis back in 2008 or so. I was in high school at the time. A buddy that I'll call Eric and myself would do some urban exploring by sneaking into empty, abandoned and foreclosed homes. Of course, we do these explorations in the dead of night to avoid any trouble with the law. I can't give away the location because people now live there. I have no scientific, rational explanation for what had happened, but I know what I saw and heard, so I'd like to share it with everyone. So we set out around 12 a.m., just like we would any night. About an hour or so in, we find a house that I often saw on my walks to school. As we walk up to the house, we scan for anyone and make our way down the large driveway that leads into the backyard of the house. The first thing I noticed is how tall the grass was, like it hadn't been mowed in quite some time. Months, I'd say. Then I noticed a smaller house further near the back of the property. We told ourselves we'd check that house out once we've explored the bigger one. We entered the bigger house from the door that leads into the garage, and from the garage we stepped into the kitchen. Believe it or not, the doors were unlocked. When we entered the kitchen, we saw the house was almost pitch black, so we could only see a few feet ahead, thanks to the street lights. So I had to use my only light source at the time, a cheap flip phone with the screen brightness on max. We started our exploration down the hallway and checked out each room. 5 in total, counting the 2 living rooms. Eric is close behind me as we make our way through each room and eventually back to the kitchen. Once in the kitchen, we chat about how nice the house is, and its size given the area that it's in, because it was much bigger than the surrounding houses. As we're talking, I notice a metal decoration hanging above the kitchen doorway. It almost looked like some sort of a decorative shield. I pull it from its spot and inspect it closely. Once done, I can't figure out how to put it back, so I set it between my feet on the tile floor. I take a look at my friend and take a step into the kitchen. Then we both hear what sounds like something sliding along the floor, and then a bang at the end of the hall. Eric and I both freeze and stare at one another through the streetlight shining through the kitchen window, and Eric whispered to me, "Is there someone here with us? Did someone follow us in?" I honestly didn't know, but after a minute or two, we decided to walk down the hall and see what the noise was. As my phone light creeps to the end of the hall, we see the shield that I just pulled down. We were both relieved, and I thought, well, maybe I'd kicked it and stepped and didn't notice. I picked it up and this time figured out how it needs to be attached to its original position. Once again, I look at Eric and take a step towards him and hear a few clangs on the floor, and that familiar sliding sound across the floor and the bang against the wall. Now we're really scared and frozen, not moving for what seemed like forever. Then an even louder bang is heard at the other end of the house, and we both jump and stare into the dark hallway. Then another bang, and then there was quiet. And then there were 3 rapid bangs. Someone was thrashing around in the very last room of the house, and we didn't know what the fuck to do. Determined not to let this person scare us, we run towards that last room and confront the asshole. But when we get there, there's nothing. No one. The room was absolutely empty. We were sure it was coming from this room, and there's no way whoever it was had slipped by us. The room did have a sliding glass door leading into the backyard, but it was locked from the inside. Then, before we could gather our thoughts and ask each other what was happening, the banging started again, this time from the kitchen. Scared out of our fucking minds, we both agreed that it was time to leave. We made our way through the back door in the room and finally to the streets, all the while checking over our shoulders to ensure no one was going to come running out of the house after us. No one came, and the neighborhood was quiet. Eric and I start our walk home, talking about the house, when Eric notices his pocket knife is missing. He then turns his pockets inside out to show me that he isn't joking. We stop, and he keeps telling me that we have to go back for it since it's his favorite one. Frustrated, I asked him, "How did you lose it if it's your favorite knife?" He assures me he never removed it from his pocket and has no idea how it could have been removed from his pocket. I agree to go with him and find it. We make it halfway up the street when Eric tells me his back feels like it's on fire. I can see it's really bothering him because of the expression of pain on his face. He asks me to lift his shirt and look at what could be causing the burning sensation. I lift his shirt and quickly notice 3 very large scratches starting from his right shoulder blade, going all the way down to his left hip, then from his left hip across to his right hip. I tell him this and he immediately says the house is haunted, but he still wants to get his knife. I was scared, but I wasn't going to let him go alone. So we made our way back to the house and immediately hear that banging noise. We made a pact with each other that we would not run no matter what had happened. We begin our search for the knife, looking high and low, all while hearing banging, and now things are being thrown across the room. Of course, fucking scared shitless and want to leave, but we haven't found the knife yet. We do one pass through the entire house and end up in the kitchen. In the kitchen there's an entrance to the second living room that you can see from the backyard. In that room there's one piece of furniture, a hutch. Now, we'd already checked this room since it's near our point of entrance and found nothing, but we decide one more pass through the room wouldn't hurt. I make my way into the dark room and let my light lead me to the hutch. And there it is. On the hutch we found the knife. But for fucking sure we had checked this room and the hutch. He didn't hesitate for a moment. He grabbed the knife and we hightailed it out, through the garage and back onto the street. This is far from the end of the story, but to summarize, this house is fucked up.